Welcome back. So now you've seen the Roman military expansion. Italy, Carthage, Macedonia, Greece, some very basic steps in Roman expansion. You should obviously understand that the Romans were also gradually expanding into other territories too. They would go into Gaul, they would go into Spain, they would go further east in Greece, North Africa, all of that also matters too. But for right now, we're going to step away from the military expansion per se and now talk about the consequences. And yes, there were consequences. Even though there were obviously a lot of benefits that came from the Roman military expansion, such as power and money and resources, trade, art, architecture, music, literature, just the general encounter with new civilizations and all the ideas that came with it. Lots of good things about Roman military expansion. But there turned out to be some unfortunate political and socioeconomic consequences as well that were unforeseen. You know, there's always such a thing as an unforeseen consequence. So here's the problem. One of the things to realize is that there is a distinction in Roman political nomenclature between land that is owned by the state versus land that is owned by private citizens. The term for land owned by the state, which includes, this is important, which includes territory taken over in military conquest, the term for that is ager publicus, which is basically publicly owned land or publicly owned territory, specifically land that could be used for farming. Now, in Roman law, in the Republic, a Roman citizen was allowed to own as much private land as he could feasibly get hold of, subject presumably to some other laws. There was no specific restriction about that. But there was a problem when it came to public land. The amount of public land that a particular individual citizen could accumulate from the Roman state was supposed to be restricted to a particular amount of territory and the amount of crops one could grow on that territory, and it was 500 URI. And URI is a measure of bushels of wheat. And the amount of territory that could sustain this much wheat production is the amount of territory that was supposed to be restricted as to publicly owned land. Again, state-owned land, including territory taken over by expansion. You can see the problem here. Because the Romans got hold of land really quickly all of a sudden, as they went from Italy down to North Africa and then quickly over to Macedonia and Greece, the difficulty was all of a sudden, in the matter of just a few decades, they quintupled the amount of territory that they had. And of course, the citizens who were going to get hold of this territory eventually for their own private ownership were going to be a relatively few who happened to be in the right place at the right time. It's in this context that now that the equites class becomes so important, because certain members of the plebeian class who were there to take advantage of the new opportunities, the new expansion, the new territory that was available, were the ones who were going to be able gradually to accumulate a lot of territory. Also, interestingly, even Roman freedmen, that means Romans who were ex-slaves, who had been manumitted from slavery by their masters, even these people could in fact conduct themselves in business, and in fact their former masters often would pay them a certain amount of money to start them off in business, and those freedmen would then owe certain social obligations to their former masters in exchange for that assistance in business. So these freedmen could also enter the economic world essentially as entrepreneurs as part of this equites class eventually, and be able to make their way up. So that's a lot of this is the genesis of the equites class and the strengthening of it in the late middle to late Republic. All right, so what you get eventually is the formation of a thing called a Latifundium, which is a huge conglomerate estate of many different portions of territory all brought together that might be owned by somebody quite wealthy. This, in fact, the concept of a really big estate multiple lands in different places is the origin of the eventual feudal system. The whole notion about the castle with all the serfs all around it working the land and such that you see in medieval manuscripts, for instance. That's where this comes from. This turns out to be a problem because that means that now we have, in a way, a kind of new plutocracy, as it were, to go along with the senatorial aristocracy that we spoke about in previous videos. This is now a group of people who are so wealthy as to distinguish themselves financially and politically above the rest of the plebs. And so the original two-way split is going to become a three-way split and is going to become more entrenched as we now have a new set of haves and have-nots. We now have the really wealthy and the not so wealthy, essentially. Another have-not split. So we have a family-oriented have-not split and a wealth-oriented have-not split. As you can imagine, this is going to exacerbate tensions all through the Republic in a big way. Now, the issue about Ager Publicus, of course, is also that, as we mentioned, only a few people were going to be placed in correctly, financially and politically, to be able to benefit from the territorial expansion of the Romans. That means, not surprisingly, that there are going to be quite a few people who are going to get hold of territory that's going to well exceed the 500 jugera limit. So as a consequence, we're going to have a relatively few Roman citizens, probably a very small percentage, they talk about 1%, a very small percentage of Roman citizens who will benefit from Roman expansion in a private economic way, and they will do it excessively and technically illegally. The problem is, however, that this law was kind of a dusty old one from many years ago, and this particular law was not being observed for quite a long period of time. It's going to be in this context that eventually there's going to be a big clash that's going to come up among the plebeian leadership, because plebeians are eventually going to realize, as this problem exacerbates itself, that a relatively small select few members of Roman society are benefiting off the skins of everybody else, and doing so in a way that in fact is contrary to Roman law. So that's going to bring us to the major inception of the late Republican crisis, when two brothers, the Gracchi brothers, are going to step up as tribunes to oppose the violation of this law and try to make many other changes to look out for the general populace of plebeians, who still are probably not any wealthier or better off than 100 to 200 years prior to this. All right, so that's where we stand at this point. So in our next series of videos, we will begin looking a lot more closely at what's going on with the consequences of Roman military expansion and the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic, the period that we call the Late Republic. Okay, we will see you on next video.